before I heard from Professor Shashibala about it. And it was he who suggested that I must join, and I thought that this will give me an opportunity to meet many students and colleagues in this conference. So I am grateful to him to have suggested me that I should come and join this session and deliver the keynote address. When I heard this theme, the crisis of multiple identities in the contemporary world, I was reminded of a particular phrase which my teacher, Professor Dharmendra Goyal, used to mention often. And that phrase is simultaneity of the non-contemporaneous. I repeat, simultaneity of the non-contemporaneous. By this phrase he used to mean that we think we are contemporaries, but if we look at the world, we will find that simultaneously in different parts of the world, different times are existing together. That is, that in India itself, if you go to forests of Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, and if you come to Mumbai or Delhi or Bengaluru, I think the year may be the same, 2015, but the life world of the people is so different that some people are living, say, in 17th century and some people are living in 21st century. So when we are thinking of the contemporary world, I think it is important that we should not forget that this is an illusion. There is no contemporaneity. The New York, Paris, London, or you can think of the many cities of the, what Professor Barrar suggested as Western Europe and North America, they may be living in what we may not be able to reach even in the 22nd century. Because the kind of advancement which we are replicating, we are not doing it. We are only copying, imitating. While they will be doing something much more at the vantage point at which they stand. So first of all, when we have to think of the crisis, I think the crisis is primarily of this non-contemporaneity. That is, that we think we are living contemporaneously, but actually we are not in a position, and the reason is not one but many. Firstly, the technological inequality, the economic inequality, the social inequality, and I think Professor Barrar very rightly emphasized that this was the hope of the moderns, that one day science and technology will help us to know and understand the world on one hand, and technology will help us to solve all the problems that human beings live with. Unfortunately, this hope is a misplaced hope. Misplaced because we are, as human beings, finite beings, limited beings. And we shall never be immortal, we shall never be omniscient, we shall never be omnipotent, we shall never be perfect. So given these limitations, I think to hope that we shall be on one day hum honge kamyab ek din ya wo subah kabhi to aayegi, that is a pious wish, pious hope we can live with. But I think the ground realities in which we have to live every moment are very different. And this human condition is a permanent condition. So when we think of crisis of multiple identities, and since Rab Sahib referred to Guru Nanak Dev Ji, I would say in his times also there were crises, conflicts of these multiple identities. And one way in which he suggested us, advised us, I would like to begin with that. That is na ko Hindu, na ko Musliman. Manas ki jaat ek hi pehchan ho. If we accept this message of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, that we as human beings are one, and we must see each other in each other's images as one, and we should not see our identities as exclusionary identities ridden with conflicts. Perhaps the kind of crisis which we are facing, we will not be able to overcome it totally because we cannot become like him, but we can at least take some lessons from Guru Nanak Dev Ji that we must begin to identify. The question is, it can be asked, the question of identity at the individual level. The question of identity can also be asked at the collective levels. When we ask the question, who am I? I'm asking it at a singular individual level. When I'm asking the question, who are we? I'm thinking of some collectivity. But notice here, in asking either the question at the individual level or act of differentiation. I can understand myself as an I, a self, only when I differentiate myself from others. I can differentiate my collectivity as a we the Punjabis, we the Indians, we the South Asians, we the human beings. Somewhere there has to be an other which has to be posited in order to think of an identity. I think one of the major problems is not that of multiple identities, but what my poet friend, who is not living anymore, but he had written a poem during his student days at Punjab University, is the issue of loss of identity. I think it is the loss of identity which creates a crisis, because I have no sense of my being my own. I will just recall two lines of this poem. मेरा कोई नाम नहीं, मेरा एक रोल नंबर है. मेरी कोई था नहीं, मेरा एक रूम नंबर है. When we have this kind of it, I have no location. I have no name by which I identify myself. It's a number which identifies me. 131, as I was living, you see, when I lived in the hostel at Punjab University. Block 1, room 31. So, 131 is there. Now, this, you see, loss of identity, I think is important, because when we have to think of the question of identity, firstly, let's go back to the past. When we were agrarian societies, agriculture was our primary, activity of life. The land would not move. We would be staying on that land, not for years, not for decades, but for centuries, generations. So we had a sense of belonging to a place. And because we had a sense of belonging to a place, we had a sense of belonging to the people who belong to that place. Now, with the mode of production changing from agrarian societies to industrial societies, from industrial societies to post-industrial societies, I think this dislocation, this displacement in which we can move constantly from one place to another, migrating from here to there. People come from some other parts of India to Punjab, Punjabis go to other parts of the world, and this is happening at such a fast speed thanks to the transportation technologies. But what is happening is that this dislocation, which makes me move from the place with which I identified myself. Like we think of a Punjabi identity. But when we think of a Punjabi identity, people in Punjab across the border this side, people of Punjab across the border on the other side, people who are of Punjabi origin, living not in Punjab either here nor there, say other parts of India or other parts of Pakistan, and people of Punjab living in Canada, in UK, in USA and other parts of the world. Somewhere we identify ourselves in terms of what? In terms of our geographical origins, in terms of our cultural civilizational heritage, in terms of our common language. I think somewhere, as I said, that each identity has to posit an other in order to differentiate itself, to have a sense of its own, that this is what I am and this is what we are. And it is in this context that new kinds of identities which have come up as a result of the processes of globalization, which are, you see, as Professor Brar introduced himself, that he is a chemistry man, he is a chemist. So, there could be a global identity of chemists, without any caste, without any creed, without any religion, because they are doing the same thing, whether in Amritsar or in New York or in BJ. Because their aims are the same, their methods are the same, their problems are the same, and that is what gives them a collective identity in terms of the activity that they engage in. I think it is here also the boundaries are not that fixed. Because within chemistry, there are new cutting edge areas in which researches are going on, which brings in interdisciplinarity. We not only think of the traditional classical divisions of chemistry in terms of the inorganic, organic, physical. We also think of biochemistry, and now one can think of many other new chemistries. So what I am trying to suggest is that when we are thinking of these multiple identities, firstly, let us accept it that the world is not what we have known through history, through culture, through heritage, because the context in which those civilizational concerns were articulated, those times are different from the times which are yet to come. And it is in this context that locations which gave us our identities earlier, that even in the context of a Punjabi identity, one will say, Acha ji, wo Malwaiya, he is from Malwa, he is from Doaba, he is from Potoha. So within the identity also we could think of sub-identities. My first concern is what I had suggested in a UNESCO conference on globalization and cultural diversities, that there are different ways of looking at these interactions, this plurality. One is the model of domination, hegemonization. That's what Europe did in the context of the whole period of colonialism. That it dominated, it manipulated, it controlled, and suggested that the European culture, European civilization is the best, and the rest of the world, in order to become civilized, as Rudyard Kipling had said, white man's burden has to follow the West, because we are backward. We have to develop like them. Only by developing like them, we become modern, we become civilized. I think that kind of arrogance was a misplaced arrogance on the part of modern Europe. I'm glad that in the context of our anti-colonial struggles, in the context of our own way of searching for our collective quest for self-identity at the pan-Indian level, I will say, in fact, it would be better if we say South Asian level. Why? Because I would like to share, some of you may have heard this anecdote from me before also, because I like to refer to this in the context of identities. When I went to Europe for the first time, whenever I would see a face similar to what I thought quote-unquote Indian, I would feel very happy that I am finding another fellow like me in the aliens, that is the Europeans. And I will say, are you from India? And the answer will be a harsh answer. No, I am from Pakistan. No, I am from Bangladesh. No, I am from Sri Lanka. And I realized that I was asking the question in the wrong way. So I started asking from the third day onwards. It took me only 2 days to get this, foolishness out of me. I would say, are you from South Asia? They will say, yes, I am from South Asia, I am from India. 80% would be from India, 20% would be from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and so on, but we had no problems. I think somewhere the problem is where the other sees me as trying to dominate, to subordinate, to hegemonize. So I think instead of talking of pan-Indian, if we need to think of, we must think of the larger cultural civilizational heritage of South Asia, of which two traditions are very important. One is the Sufi tradition, the other is the Gurubani tradition. And both the traditions have taught us that let us believe in the unity of humankind. Let us believe in the spiritual unity of humankind. I think this is an important message which South Asia provides, and this is in contrast to the missionary mode in which the Semitic traditions have operated. You see, one way is to dominate. Look at the Buddhist message, the Jain message. There is diversity, but at the same time, this diversity is not of exclusion. This diversity is not of hegemonization. This diversity is basically in the spirit of dialogue. As Guru Nanak Dev Ji had said, Kichu suniye, kichu kariye. It's that listen, then say, rather than what we are seeing on the media, meri suno, or hum kisi ki sunenge nahi, hum sirf sunayenge. This culture is basically the source of crisis that we are thinking of, that multiple identities, but each identity saying, my identity is the privileged one and you have to assimilate in this identity. So this quest of, trying to dominate in search of assimilation as Professor Brown rightly suggested, that we have to respect diversities. And respecting diversities means willingness to listen to a different point of view. And since we are teachers of philosophy here, gathering in a meet of philosophy teachers, I would say the first lesson that I used to give to my students of MA Part 1 in Chandigarh, and now I do it in JNU, that the first lesson which students and teachers of philosophy should always remember is, for every philosopher there is an equal, and please note, equal, neither more nor less. For every philosopher there is an equal and opposite philosopher. If there is an idealist, there is a materialist. If there is a rationalist, there is an irrationalist. And you can add to this list. I need not, you see, exhaust it. The second rule is, both of them think that the other must be wrong and to be proved so. And they try to do so. In this I will give you another anecdote. When I submitted my PhD thesis, one of my teachers, one of my Guru Bhai's friends, we have known each other in all the three identities, Professor Vishambar Pati. He had come to Chandigarh from Jaipur for some meeting. So I very happily told him, Bhai Sahab, मैंने अपना thesis जमा कर दिया. He said, दो मुझे मैं पढ़ूंगा. I'll read it. I gave it to him. He took it to the guest house, read it at night. Next day when he came for that meeting, he complimented me, and it's very difficult to get a compliment from Professor Pati. बहुत अच्छा thesis लिखा है तुमने. मुबारक हो. I was very happy. But after 2 minutes silence, he says, come to Jaipur for a week. I said, what for? He says, I'll tear your thesis to pieces. I'll prove you wrong. Bhai Sahab, you told me that you have written a good thesis, but if you are right, then I am wrong. How can I think I am wrong? This you see tendency of sorting out disagreements. I think this is a very important tendency in philosophy, that we respect differences, but at the same time, we try to resolve disagreements, but not through force, not through weapons. We have only one weapon, that is the weapon of, as my friend Shirazil has said, reason, argumentation. So, when philosophers try to prove their point of view or to question and reject the other's point of view, they do not use force except the force of reason, of dialogue, of argumentation. So, as I said, that they try to prove so. The third lesson which I give my students is, if you cannot convince your opponent to be mistaken, be ready to accept that possibly you could be mistaken. If you cannot persuade, convince your opponent to be mistaken, be ready to accept that perhaps you could be mistaken. And better still, have the courage to imagine that perhaps both of you are mistaken. I think it is this, you see, courage, to think that perhaps I am also mistaken and the other is also mistaken. This actually reminds us of our imperfections, of which I started with. That as human beings, we are imperfect beings. So, since I am imperfect, I could not be absolutely correct. That only the Almighty God, if there is one, could be, but at least I am not capable of imagining. And it is in this context I would suggest something which my favorite philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers, Simone de Beauvoir, had said. She, you see, wrote philosophy, did philosophy, but she always said she is a writer. She is not a philosopher. And the reason she gave for this was, and this is what I am trying to caution ourselves as, reminding ourselves as philosophy teachers, she said, a philosopher tends to delude himself as if he is God. Why? Because he always likes to give universal, eternal theories. Theories valid for all times, which only God can give, but human beings are not God. So she said, I would not like to be a philosopher of this delusionary variety. I would like to do philosophy in terms of the concrete, particular, specific context from which one can generalize, but one cannot claim a universal, absolute, eternal validity of a particular perspective. I think this is very important. The basic mistake in doing philosophy, when we absolutize, build up grand systems, whether it is a Platonic system, or a Kantian system, or a Hegelian system, or an Advait Vedantic system. Why only to take examples from there? Where we absolutize a system, I think there we are deluding ourselves as if God has incarnated within us and we are speaking on His behalf. I think this is something which philosophers must avoid. And if we do so, then when we want to think of this crisis, let us accept it, number one, that the times in which each particular perspective, which has local perspective and could flourish in relative isolation from one another, and thus one could think of one's own perspective as one belonged to, those times are gone. Today our crisis is seemingly of multiple identities, but I would say it is basically of loss of identity. And that loss of identity is loss of identity as a human being. I prefer to become a manager, a scientist, a bureaucrat, whatever else I may think of, but I never try to become a human being. Because becoming a human being involves thinking of our human identity. And I would say our human identity is not in terms of the kind of instrumental use of objects we make. In fact, the day Rajiv Gandhi named the Ministry of Education as Ministry of Human Resource Development, that's the time I had written an article in the Tribune that no more dehumanization of education can be done by making humans also not as humans, not to flourish them as humans, but to treat them as resources. The day we start treating human beings as resources, whether we do it for the government, for the state, for the army, or for some community, whether it is ISIS, or one can think of Hindutva elements, whenever we would think of making a Vanar Sena, see the name, Vanar Sena. On one side it is a very pejorative name. Call somebody a monkey and see what kind of response you will get. But you defy that and make them do all the mischief and say these are our Vanar Senas, I think that is also using them as resources for communal acts. I think somewhere we have to recognize that human identity is an identity of care, of respect, of acknowledgement, of confirmation of each other's excellence. And in this context, since we have been talking in the context of education, I'll give another anecdote. I was in New York 1998. One of my friend's daughter, she was class 5 student who was going to move to class 6, so she